After the era of prohibition and during the time of the Great Depression, comics became a relief in the lives of the US people. Along with the relief, publishers saw money to be made. The country was in World War II, comic books reached drawing rooms. Superheroes rose to fame and familiarity. Then came television, and the superheroes of comic books were subsequently adapted into serials and reached the bedrooms. During the 50s, turmoil in the comic book industry cost a fortune for the superhero motion pictures, and certainly all got to a halt. Then, with the emergence of the bunch of Hollywood movie brats, new Hollywood was reinvented. Sci-fi films like Star Wars break into the scenes with all guns blazing, and immediate success at the box office paved a perfect way forward for the next decade of superhero movies, especially made by DC. Richard Donner's Superman kickstarted a perfect era of commercially successful and critically acclaimed superhero films produced by DC. These two films kind of rejuvenated the excitement among the fans, and DC capitalized on it commercially. In today's episode of Marvelous Videos, we will be exploring major DC movies like Superman 2, Superman 3, Supergirl, Flash Gordon, and Batman that set the 1980s on fire, and how they have influenced the future DC movies and helped in shaping the characters. So without wasting any more time, let's dive deep into the sea of DC superhero flicks. Before we go into our explanation, we have a very small request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to our channel. This is a small click for you, but for us it means a lot. Thank you, and let's begin. Superman 2, 1980. In 1978, Richard Donner made Superman by adapting the DC Comics, which featured Christopher Reeves in the eponymous character, and the film had an ensemble cast including Marlon Brando, Gene Hackman, Terrence Stamp, Jackie Cooper, and Ned Beatty, to name a few. It built a sense of anticipation among the fans. However, the immediate success at the box office and the critical acclaim associated with it helped set the pathway for future films coming from this franchise. Hence, 2 years later, Superman 2, the second installation of the previous one, came into being. Directed by Richard Lester, Christopher Reeves returned to play the titular role, and names like Gene Hackman, Sarah Douglas, and Terrence Stamp reprised their roles and made a comeback in this sequel. The story revolves around three criminals led by the villain General Zod, played by Terrence Stamp, who escaped from the planet Krypton. Now they take control of the White House and partner with Lex Luthor, played by Gene Hackman, who wants to destroy Superman and rule the world. But Superman is fighting two battles, one internal, and on the other hand, he wants to save the planet as well. This video is not about describing the plots, but it has more to do with the exploration of different elements within the film, which help them secure a cult status. For instance, Superman has always been an urban hero, and in this film, you will see references to landmarks like Eiffel Tower, the Empire State Building, Niagara Falls, and Times Square. Superman 2 develops his element of fun in the odd relationship with his love interest Lois, played by Margot Kidder. Throughout the film, the tension between Superman and his alter ego Clark Kent has caught up the imagination of the fans. What about the other villain, General Zod? Do you know he is the only other villain apart from Lex Luthor in the comics? The look of the character General Zod, played by Terrence Stamp, has a subtlety as he is seen with a beard. Although the comic character was a clean-shaven guy, that look by Stamp created a cult following, as in the recent multiverse project, General Zod was introduced with black hair and a goatee beard. The film was an immense box office hit by the opening week. It even outpaced Spielberg's Raiders of the Lost Ark. Additionally, it was the third highest grossing film of the year 1981. The instant success of the second installment set forth the journey of DC's superhero movies of the upcoming decade. Superman 3, 1983. Richard Lester came up with the third installment of the Superman franchise, and Christopher Reeves retained the titular role. The film is all about too many ideas, too many gadgets, and too many stars. A wealthy executive, Ross Webster, hires a brilliantly evil mind, Gus Corman, to build a supercomputer that can control even the Superman. In this film, Superman also finds his evil self due to a nervous breakdown, and the inner battle he fought with himself is also of narrative importance. Although one can argue that isn't this always the point of Superman? The dark, ill-minded, and corrupted Superman, and the meek, moral, and mild-mannered Clark Kent two fight each other, but as both are superpowered, neither can defeat the other. Finally, Superman knocks Clark unconscious and puts him on the conveyor belt to be chopped up. Clark regains consciousness and strangles Superman. As Superman passes out, the two merge back into one, and Superman returns to his good self. Oh, another marvelous fact, as you know, Lex Luthor and Lois Lane may never be on the same side, but actors Gene Hackman and Margot Kidder were. Both had their differences with the producers Alexander and Ilya Salkin's treatment of director Richard Donner on Superman the movie and Superman 2. Despite directing both films simultaneously, the sequel was not completed when Donner was fired from the project. After tensions between the Salkins and Donner had reached the boiling point, the producers indeed dismissed Donner and turned the remainder of the shoot over to Richard Lester. Donner, despite his hard work, was not credited with directing Superman 2. Furious, Hackman declined to participate in Superman 3, while Kidder spoke out against the Salkins. She insisted that Lois Lane's paltry appearance in the third installment was punishment for speaking out. Superman 3 was the least successful of the first three Superman movies, but it certainly fared better than the Supergirl spin-off. However, it didn't fare well with the critics, as Roger Ebert dismissed the whole film. He argued that the whole human point of the film got lost due to its special effects, and this is true to some extent. Superman 4: The Quest for Peace, 1987. Superman 4: The Quest for Peace was the fourth and final movie in the Superman franchise, starring Christopher Reeve. There was a controversy pertaining to the return of Reeves, as the third installment didn't do well at the box office. Producer Alexander Salkin told Screen International in 1984 that the project was not contingent on the participation of Reeve, as Tarzan and James Bond are played by several actors over the years. Additionally, the failure of the Supergirl at the box office eludes Salkind for the first time. Then his wife Ilya took the decision and sold the franchise to the Cannon Group Incorporated in 1985. For the first time ever, this was the Superman movie which didn't credit Salkins as the producer. In this film, Superman is fighting a contemporary battle as he takes up the mission to abolish all nuclear weapons from the world. In my opinion, the story was developed in the backdrop of the later years of the Cold War, as from the second half of the decade, it was almost probable that the war would come to an end. However, the Cold War has nothing to do with the nuclear war, but it was used metaphorically. Meanwhile, Lex Luthor has created an evil clone of Superman called Nuclear Man, who wreaks havoc with famous landmarks around the world and does savage battles with the hero on the face of the moon until Superman discovers his nemesis' single flaw. The film didn't impress the critics due to its flawed acting, the special effects looked cheap, and the action was boring. The film also ranked 40 in the 50 worst movies ever list created by the readers of Empire magazine. Supergirl, 1984. It is actually the fourth installment of the Superman series, and it presented itself as a spin-off in the aftermath of Superman 3, directed by Gennat Swark. Although, Ilya Salkind planned to present Supergirl in the previous edition to make an introduction for this spin-off. However, Warner Bros. Was not keen on using lesser-known characters from the Superman franchise and vetoed having Supergirl appear in Superman 3. Nonetheless, before Superman 3 began principal photography, Salkind announced Supergirl. The film narrative revolves around Kara, Superman's cousin, who came to Earth to retrieve a lost paperweight-sized orb known as the Omegahedron. On Earth, she is confronted with a witch named Selena, and the battle to recover the orb grows throughout the film. Supergirl takes up the name Linda Lee, and she builds an affectionate relationship with Ethan. Without disclosing further about the storyline, let's look at some interesting elements from the flick. Curiously enough, though the movie itself was a rather poorly executed and highly disposable piece of work, Jerry Goldsmith's score remains one of his most enjoyable, with rousing fanfares that easily place it alongside his Star Trek scores. The overture is excellent proof of that, being an alternative version of the main and end title music performed at a slightly faster tempo that suits the brassy themes very well. Do you even know that the original film has been reduced to a much smaller version after the test audience review? Yes, it is. It was primarily shot to be over 2 hours long, then it was brought down to an hour and a half. The film neither did well at the box office nor was critically acclaimed. Despite its initial outburst of anticipation, it was a failed experiment, to say the least. Flash Gordon 1980. Let's move our attention from the Superman franchise to our next superhero film of the decade. Alex Raymond created the King Features comic strip of the same name, and based upon that, this superhero flick came into the motion picture in the form of a space opera, which was directed by Mike Hodges. In fact, there was a long warp and woof for the directorial role. Producer Dino De Laurentiis primarily approached George Lucas, then he talked with the Italian master Federico Fellini, which also didn't happen. Then he hired Nicholas Reg to direct the project and took writer Michael Allen, the man who wrote the famous Enter the Dragon. Later, it was reported that Laurentiis tried to convince Sergio Leone to direct, but Leone refused. Finally, it came to Mike Hodges. Gregory, Flash Gordon, is a renowned football star, and he, along with his clan, would protect the world from the villain, Ming the Merciless, who is also the emperor of the planet named Mongo. Ming's daughter, Princess Aura, fell in love with the Flash, and they escaped from the kingdom. Finally, how Flash took the attack on the kingdom is the crux of the film. The film's entire soundtrack was composed and performed by the famous rock band of the 80s, Queen. It was perhaps the earliest instance where such a famous rock band has taken the responsibility of producing the entire score. Spirit, 1987. Will Eisner's famous comic strip hero makes his debut motion picture appearance through this television drama, directed by Michael Schultz, and Sam Jones played the titular role. The story is simple. A Central City police detective named Danny is shot and thought to be dead. Then he kind of reincarnated, wearing a blue suit and mask, and proceeds to fight against crime as the Spirit. The Spirit has a love angle with a police commissioner's daughter, Ellen. His main mission is to bust an art forgery racket run by the notorious femme fatale, Pagel, played by McKinley Robinson. The film is an outright attempt to pay homage to the film noirs of the 40s. However, in the decade of the 80s, film noir changed its route, and various neo-noir films came into the foray in the 70s. The way the film uses various character tropes takes us back to the sets of Orson Welles' Citizen Kane, or say, Billy Wilder's Sunset Boulevard. As a matter of fact, the production wanted to make the set in the style of the 40s, but due to budget constraints, the project had to take another route. The architecture of the sets took a much more modern and archaic tone, but we will see the team of art directors in Batman.
Wouldn't hit a guy with glasses on, would you? Huh?
Batman 1989. Next up in our video is perhaps the most well-known DC comic strip character, Batman. This is the first installment of the Warner Bros. Batman film series directed by Tim Burton. The title Batman is played by Michael Keaton, and Batman's arch-foe, Joker, is played by none other than Jack Nicholson. Keaton's casting was controversial, as leading men were considered. Keaton was typecast as a comic character, so there were initial inhibitions to give him the serious role of Batman. The story is simple. Batman treads the shadow zone between right and wrong, fights to defend the innocents, and tries to keep his guarded secret identity as the millionaire philanthropist, Bruce Wayne. One astonishing sequence came when Joker told the catchphrase to Batman, "Have you ever danced with the devil in the pale moonlight?" Batman identified that the Joker was the killer of his parents. The trend is set from this moment on to the next decades of Batman flicks, where aesthetic and pivotal catchphrases are an integral part of Batman films. Discussing the central themes, director Tim Burton once stated that Batman is all about fights between the two freaks. The mythology of two disturbed persons stands on this sole point. In fact, the art design of Batman constantly refers back to the Art Deco designs of the 1910s. Art Deco is a style of visual arts, architecture, and the product design that was first seen in the streets of Paris and later flourished in the USA as well as in Europe during the 1920s. The design of Gotham City in the films was clearly influenced by this Art Deco, and the sets hold similarities with films like The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari and Metropolis from the 20s. We have to remember that the film was released in the wake of globalization, and during the release of this film, a populist strategy of merchandise sales was started in the USA. This phenomenon of Batmania followed the later decades. Swamp Thing, 1982. Len Wein and Bernie Wrightson's DC comic character Swamp Thing was made to the screen through the direction of Wes Craven. It tells the story of a scientist and how peculiarly he was transformed into the titular monster through a dysfunctional experiment in a laboratory. The film is quite literally influenced by Werner Herzog's masterpiece The Enigma of Caspar Hauser. We must mention the supervillain Anton Arcane, played by Louis Jordan in the film and also in its sequel, who is the archenemy of Swamp Thing. The significance of Arcane can only be understood when we see his returns in other media. For instance, Arcane appears as the final boss in the video game Swamp Thing. Arcane wanted to become immortal, so he tried to build another new body for himself, but couldn't do so. He possesses the power to create synthetic organs and skins. He also has the skill to do necromancy, a magical superpower to communicate with the dead. So DC fans, the next time you visit this old classic, do look for the character archetype of the villain Arcane apart from the hero. The Return of Swamp Thing, 1989. This is the sequel to the 1982 film and directed by the genre great Jim Wynorski. Here, the supervillain Anton Arcane is resurrected after his death from the first film. Anton's daughter, Abigail Arcane, played by Heather Locklear, seeks answers to her mother's mysterious death, so she comes to the Florida swamps to confront her evil stepfather. Dr. Arcane captures his daughter to perform some weird genetic experiments on her, but she is rescued by the hero Swamp Thing. Abigail falls in love with the Swamp Thing and insists on staying with him in the swamps and grows into a flower, which symbolizes that Abigail might be the Lady Swamp Thing in the future. The film received more or less neutral reviews from the critics' circle. Also, it did reasonably well at the box office. Marvelous verdict. In the spring of 1938, the fledgling comic book industry was jolted by the publication of Action Comics. This was something new. The cover depicted a character in a skin-tight blue and red costume. This was no mere humorous or detective strip. This was the birth of a superhero. And when these comic strips came into the motion picture, it lambasted the medium with its insurmountable glory and success. Henceforth, the decade of the 1980s will be remembered for its rejuvenation of DC comic strips into the films. In today's episode, we covered a large proportion of the films that came into that decade in the hope of reviving some excitement regarding the old classics in the era of fast-paced Marvel and DC multiverse. Hope you enjoyed it, and if you liked our content, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to us if you haven't already. Have a good one and be safe. Thanks everyone.